One of the most accomplished super heavyweights. Get the f out of here, dude. So I've been asked a lot to do a video on training twice per day. And this is because I've mentioned that I myself have been doing 2 times a day for the past couple mesocycles, and it's resulted in quite a bit of PRs. Basically, if you're someone who feels like you have a pretty good grasp on what you're weak in, you might not have quad strength, you might not have hamstring or posterior strength, you might be good at squatting, you might be good at pulling, you might be bad at squatting, you might be bad at pulling, then the only thing you can do, aside from having a coach look at your technical abilities, is to do more. Weightlifting, like most sports, follows the SAID principle, specific adaptation to imposed demands. In Matt Perryman's book, Squat Every Day, he paraphrases Vlad Zatsiorsky. Zatsiorsky says the idea is to train as heavy as possible, as often as possible, and as fresh as possible. One of the most accomplished super heavyweights in Leonid Ternenko said that he trained 6 days a week, 3 times a day, and up to 6 hours per day. The coach of the Bulgarians and the creator of the Bulgarian system took the concept of doing more to the extreme. Abadjeyev's lifters would often train for 8 hours a day. And adaptability isn't just muscular, it's primarily neurological. Again, in the book Squat Every Day, Matt Perryman talks about neurologist Donald Hebb's theory, cells that fire together, wire together. Basically, if you have nerve A and it excites nerve B regularly, some metabolic change takes place in both cells so that A's efficiency in firing B increases. This sort of neurological efficiency can happen when you're learning a language, and it can also happen when you're snatching and clean and jerking. So when we look at the part of the quote where Vlad Zatsiorsky says, train as often as possible, we understand why frequency matters. More practice or more frequency, more neurological efficiency. So when we look at that quote saying train as heavy as possible, well, it's important to understand that a lot of people shouldn't be training as heavy as possible. People who haven't gone through appropriate phases leading up to that point shouldn't go as heavy as possible. As soon as they prepare for going as heavy as possible, then yes, it's important to go heavy, and it's important to do that frequently. But what about the average Joe, the hobbyist? The previous examples I gave of multiple training sessions per day were of genetic freaks, and they did have some special supplements to help them out. Having said that, I think that training 2 times a day on either 2 or 3 days a week is actually better than training 1 time a day. When you train 2 times a day, you can actually do less per session and end up doing more volume per day. For instance, if your goal is to hit 90% for 3 singles in a session, you could actually hit 2 singles in the morning and 2 singles at night. If you didn't feel like doing 2 singles of the same movement again, you can put those singles in another session later in the week. Either way, you're doing 2/3 of the work per session, but 1 1/3 the work per day. This can lead to a lot more volume safely within a meso or macro cycle. Another reason 1 session per day may be hard is that you only have 1 chance to fix a certain technical error. It puts a lot of pressure on 1 session per day. And when you're trying to peak and you want to add in more volume or intensity, it can be very hard to complete those sessions successfully. Again, let's talk about that 90% for 3 or 4 singles. Let's say that's doable on 1 week. Now, how do you overload that? It becomes a lot harder to overload the next week. You can go up to 95%, you can stay at 90% and add another single or a couple singles. The issue now comes when you have a 2.5-hour session and now we have to add on more volume. The pressure of having a good session for that day is much higher because it's the only time that you can work on that thing, unless you have it later on in the microcycle, but that might mentally mess with you when you're unable to complete the snatches or the clean and jerk for that day at the appropriate percentage. If you split those 2 sessions up, you might not have a good session in the morning, pack it in, kind of take a step back, relax, come back at night, and hopefully you can do better. At least that alleviates some of the pressure and some of the tension. Another underrated reason as to why training 2 times a day can be more beneficial is because the amount of non-working sets or technically non-working sets that you can have. You work up, you might hit 50% for a double, 60% for a double, 65% for a double, 70 for a single, 75 for a single, 80 for a single, 85 for a single, and then your 95 singles. Well, what if you had 2 sessions where you worked up to 90%? You did all of those warm-up reps, you did your sets at 90%. Then you come in again and you do all of those warm-up sets again and you do 90%. Just because they're not working sets doesn't mean they're not important. Those non-working sets are great chances to work on technique. And when you train 2 times a day, you get double the amount of chances to work on your technique. Now, I talked about a peaking phase in which you're hitting 90% for singles. That, to me, is where frequency helps tremendously. And the same way that it's easier to overload, it is easier to deload. When deloading, all you need to do now is just take away one of the sessions. Maybe you can take away some volume as well, but at least you can keep the weight heavy leading up to competition. When the intensity is high on deloads, you can better maintain a feel for heavy weights in preparation for competition. I like to lift heavy on deloads, but that doesn't mean that I'm killing myself on deloads. It's important to understand that 2 times a day is not actually the biggest commitment. Each session can be substantially shorter, and you'll find that in the second session of the day, it takes a lot less time to warm up. The goal is to expose yourself to more adaptive stimuli. This can manifest itself in the way of the Bulgarian training methodology, but it can more importantly manifest itself into simply squatting in the morning and snatching or clean and jerking at night, or vice versa. You don't have to have 2 full sessions, but it's important to keep exposing yourself to training stimuli more times per week, especially if you want to break those plateaus. I hate to use myself as an example, but I truly believe there is no way I could have upped my competition total by 14 kilos from one competition to the next. And competition total is very important to me because there needs to be a certain level of comfort with the weights that you choose to use in competition. So if you're looking to start doing 2 times a day, I have an 8 session per week block up on my Patreon right now. For just $1 a month, you can get that program and you can test out if 2 times a day is right for you. If you haven't built up the capacity or the fitness or specific strength, don't worry, just go to another one of my programs, either the first 4 weeks of Super Compensation or the first 4 weeks of the Superhuman program. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope to see you on the next one.